Hi, and welcome to A Film I Love with the Cambridge Film Festival. My name's Jenny. I'm one of the trustees of the Cambridge Film Trust, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Anna Bogutskaya, film programmer, broadcaster, writer, and creative broadcaster, to share a film you love. And you have picked All About My Mother, 1999 release, Oscar winner, BAFTA winner, directed and written by Pedro Almodóvar. Firstly, welcome along. Thank you for picking a film you love.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. It's such a pleasure. I mean, you don't need to really give me much to get me talking about any films, but specifically an Almodóvar film.
And so, I mean, you've got your CV is amazing. It's so impressive. Film and events programmer at BFI, currently festival director at Underwire Festival, host of the brilliant Final Girls podcast. And earlier on in your career, you worked at El Deseo, Pedro's company. Can you tell me a bit about what you did, what it was like?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, as I was rewatching the film last night, I had a little cry thinking about the fact that that was one of my first proper job in film. Like I did an MA in Madrid where I was living at that time, and the way that I like to tell it is that I was so obnoxious in my classes that they hired me before I finished the MA. So I started off as an intern, and around the time that they were finishing off about like halfway through production with The Skin I Live In, and then kind of stayed on full time for a few years. So I worked a lot across, it's a very small company, El Deseo. It's a family company, really. It's owned by Pedro and Agustin, who are his brother, his longtime producer, the producer for All About My Mother. And it's such a fascinating place to work in. And when I think about it, even in retrospect, it's like being in an Almodóvar film. That's the way that it looks. That's the way that it feels. And I was kind of looking after comms because I spoke several languages. I would deal with international projects as well. So I'd be assisting the head of international. And when we were in production, everybody kind of chipped in a little bit into everything. You'd do runner things, you'd do office work, and then I'd also kind of be a point of contact for anyone who was trying to get access to the archive. So kind of any information or, books, research, dealt with a lot of any kind of exhibition projects or touring programs. There's so much continuous interest in his cinema and his body of work, and they have done such an amazing job at keeping an archive and kind of knowing what's where. And so I would kind of be dealing with people from all around the world, working from in productions that we were doing in-house, to also helping out with the exhibition that suddenly comes to mind is the Jean-Paul Gaultier exhibition that was touring around the world a few years ago. So he obviously designed a few pieces for Almodóvar films, and those are kept in a place, and someone has to help kind of maneuver all of that. So I had a job title, but to be honest, didn't mean anything because we all did whatever was necessary. So the easiest way to describe it is I worked across communications and international projects and helped out with anything else that was needed, really.
Wow. And so from that experience, I mean, did that partly influence your decision when we asked you to pick a film you love? I mean, you gave loads of great suggestions, but why this one? And out of his brilliant body of work, why All About My Mother?
Well, I'll be honest, it's a film I love. I also really just love talking about his work and about Spanish cinema in general. I think one of the things that's I sometimes have to always remind people is that I'm actually from Spain. So I have a lot of fondness for Spanish cinema, and especially kind of earlier stuff in particular. I really, really love Pedro's work, particularly from the 80s and the early 90s. This was, I think this film in particular picked it because it's a very good entry point into his work. It sits so well right bang in the middle of an enormous career that is still, completely ongoing. He's making work practically, you know, every couple of years. His latest film obviously was Plain and Glory, which premiered at Cannes, and all of his films are released in the UK as well. So he's not an inaccessible director, but it's easy sometimes to forget to go back into this body of work of somebody. And this film is not only the one, it's not the one that catapulted him to international stardom. That was Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown from '88. It's a very, that one is a high camp comedy in many ways. This is pure drama. And it's the one that really garnered him so many awards and is frankly just a beautiful, borderline perfect film. And it's a beautiful one to come into because it has a lot of Almodóvar flavor that if you go back into his previous work, you'll see the humor, you'll see the punkiness, you'll see the colors, you know, the cinematic influences, the references, his absolute love for cinema as an art form. And I think he really rivals only Scorsese in terms of how much of a cinephile he is and how much that is visible in his work. And even when I was rewatching it last night, directly afterwards, I started watching another film because once you see one of his stories, you kind of want to go deeper and see what he made after, what he made before. And there's such a journey. And I think because this film is so perfectly timed and so perfectly placed in kind of the middle of his evolution as a filmmaker, it's a very good entry point for anyone who's never seen it, and for anyone who has seen it and who have perhaps, you know, seen other Almodovar films. And his newest work is actually his first English language project, The Human Voice with Tilda Swinton. It's even a short film and it's going to get a theatrical release, but I think this is also a good way to revisit it because I've seen this film a number of times. I forget how many, and I was still in absolute tears. It was like seeing it anew. It's one of these films that changes, that kind of mutates as you change as a person. So if you see this film suited, you'll see one thing. And then when you grow older and when you revisit it, you'll be uncovering so many more layers to it. Some of them will relate to your personal life, and some of them will just be unlocking the different layers of what he is showing in his work. And you know, that's the beautiful thing about him. He's so endlessly rewatchable.
He is. That's such a good point. That's such a good point. So you said you rewatched it last night. Can you remember the first time you saw it? Like where you were, how old you were, that kind of thing?
You know what? It's not actually the first Almodovar film that I watched. I was trying to remember the exact time, and I'm pretty sure I was a student, so I was in university, and this is the film that everybody knows. It was a huge hit in Spain, and I kind of, I think, almost didn't want to watch it because I didn't feel punky enough.
Yeah.
I gravitated towards his earlier stuff because it's so raw and energetic and funny and kind of very, you know, responding to the political climate of the 70s and 80s in Spain. So it's very in your face, and that kind of gelled more with me at that time. And then the deeper I got into cinephilia, into auteur cinema, into European cinema in particular, into classical Hollywood cinema, which he loves a lot as well, and which is very explicitly referenced in All About My Mother. And the more, and once I started working at El Deseo, I saw, you know, all of it kind of merged together, but at the same time, I saw each film in connection with all of the other ones. So I started seeing all his work as a body of work, a film that was speaking to the previous film, and then the next films would speak to, you know, a film from the 80s and whatever. There's actually one of the fascinating things that I started kind of seeing the more I watched and rewatched and revisited and read and kind of worked around the archive of his work is the fact that they're all kind of in relationship to one another. In fact, the plot of All About My Mother is referenced in an earlier film from 1995, The Flower of My Secret. There's a scene where, you know, some surgeons, doctors are kind of practicing telling a grieving mother that her son has died. And that's, you can see that that's the inspiration for the plot of this film. It's the start of it, and then it gets grown and developed and blossoms into what this film becomes. So this kind of cinematic universe approach almost, which is now very common. You know, we've got the Marvel universe, we've got a lot of it's a completely radical departure from the themes of Almodóvar or even Marvel, but you know, the Kevin Smith VSQ universe, you know, these filmmakers who have work that talks to each other and kind of exists in one concrete world that they have created. You can see that in his work as well, but with the benefit that you can go into every single bit of it is perfectly formed in and of itself. So you can go into All About My Mother, absolutely love it, and then go to something else and see nods and references in his own work to it, which I find, again, just fascinating. And one of the things that makes him so appealing as a filmmaker to discover and rediscover constantly.
And so with
regards for a very clear question, I was like, I don't remember, but let me tell you about this.
No, but it's brilliant, and it's so true. I mean, because there's obviously there are like Las Chicas de Almodóvar, like, you know, the actresses who he returns to working with and has done over the decades, which is something that, yeah, it is that feeling of being, once you're aware of the universe, it's almost like being part of not a club, because it's welcome to everyone, but I love seeing the familiar faces pop up across the years in his films. And I mean, in this one in particular, so Cecilia Roth, she's been in a couple of his films. Penelope Cruz has obviously been in quite a lot in more recent years. Also Marisa Paredes as well. There's a really nice, I mean, it's a fascinating group of actresses with characters within this film. I mean, can you tell us a bit, we're not going to give any spoilers away, but can you tell us a bit about the main character, Manuela, and Cecilia Roth's performance as well?
Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, I think this is really, she's a central character. She's in essence a grieving mother. We open in the very first, you know, couple of scenes of the film. She is a single mother. She is about to celebrate her son's 18th birthday. Her son is a writer. He's an aspiring writer. They've got a very, you know, fun, intellectually kind of patent-driven conversation and relationship, very close to each other. And he tragically gets killed in a car accident. He gets run over by a car when he's running to get the autograph of an actress played by Marisa Paredes, who has just been performing a play based on Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. There, and the reference of the title is a reference to All About Eve, the Bette Davis film. That love for cinema and that kind of explicit cinephilia that's in the cinema of Almodóvar is there from the very beginning. Later on, the whole drama of Manuela unfolds in her kind of making amends to her son even after his death, because she had always hidden the identity of his father from him. That was never part of the equation. It's very clearly established from the beginning that that is something that she has deliberately kept from him. He doesn't know who his father is. They've never had a conversation. He doesn't even know his name. And she decides that night to tell him all about his father. But before she can do that, her son is killed. And she donates, you know, she authorizes the donation of his organs for transplant, which is actually her job. So there's a whole layer of drama attached to that. And one of the interesting things about Manuela as a character and a mother and a grieving mother is that she's so defined by wanting to help others. She's a transplant coordinator, you could say. I'm sure that's not a proper job title, but that's kind of what she does in the film. But she wants to give constantly, and she's not really making space for herself to grieve. But she's always open to listen. You know, she listens as soon as her son tells her, this is something that I need to feel, you know, to understand who I am. I need to know who my father is. And she accepts it. And she thinks about it in a single scene and just says, you know, okay, I'll tell you all about your dad as soon as we get home. This will be, you know, this is my gift to you. And I understand that you need and you want this information. And her kind of going on this whole journey throughout the film and establishing this whole new community. She goes from Madrid, where she was living with her son, to Barcelona. And that's significant because it's also one of the, I believe it's actually definitely the first perhaps not the only film that's not set in Madrid in the filmography of Pedro, because he's, he lives in Madrid. His company is in Madrid, and Madrid is a big character throughout all of his films in the way that it's evolved as well. The flavor of Madrid in the 80s, completely different from the flavor of Madrid in the 90s and the 2000s. So kind of going back to eras and stuff. And in this film, they leave it for a very significant portion of the film. And I think that's very important to understand the character of Manuela in the context of Almodóvar's work as well, is that she is a person who takes herself, she moves away. She completely cuts herself off from her previous life. She has done that before. So we know that it's one of the ways that she deals with processing trauma, with processing grief. And the film doesn't really judge her on that. That's just the way that she operates. And it puts her in the situation where she's going to grieve without having to grieve in public in so many ways. She's kind of reinventing herself by going back to the people that she knew before. And she's trying to find her son's father as well when she travels back. So, but along the way, a lot of other things happen and a lot of other relationships are established, but everything becomes connected.
Yeah, I love one of the things I love about Pedro's films is how completely unpredictable they are. I mean, they really are. The twists and the turns, you just have to go with it. And as you say, they do stick with you, and they do change over time depending on you as a viewer, your experience. I found that, again, this isn't a spoiler, but he dedicates the film to actresses and to mothers and to everyone who puts on a performance. And I found that dedication, that I think that's what brought me to tears right at the end, was just the dedication. You've already mentioned, as the cinephilia throughout the film and the nods to acting and to actresses, but what do you think it is about this film when it comes to, are all the characters playing a role, do you think? Like, is there a performative aspect to each of the characters?
Yes, totally. That's so extremely on point, because I think it's one of the biggest themes of the film. It's, what's the role of the mother? What's the performance of grief? What is the performance of, generosity? One of Penélope Cruz's character in the film is a nun. What is the performance of empathy? One of the other kind of key characters, La Agrado, she's a transsexual sex worker. And one of the, without any spoilers, she's got so many fantastic scenes, but one in particular comes to mind where she talks about, building up your authentic self. Yeah. And what does authenticity mean? Does it mean that it has to be, does it have to be created? Can it be created? Does it have to be, quote unquote, given to you? Or can you make yourself be your authentic self, who you really are? And actresses, Uma Rojo is the other key character in the film. She's played by Marisa Paredes, who had been working with Almodóvar as well since his very early films. I think her earliest collaboration with him was in his third film, Dark Habits. And she literally gives herself a name. She gives herself a stage name. She is constantly performing, and both on stage and off. And she's also exploring in these new relationships that she establishes with Manuela, with Lagrado, and with everyone else, kind of in this new world that she starts to inhabit. Who am I? Am I the person, the famous actress who lives on stage? Is that who I am authentically? Or is it someone else that I'm just discovering now? And of course, a lot of it is about the motherhood. What is that role? Is that a performance? Is there a particular mold that it needs to fit into? And I love the dedication at the end, because it's, it's very specifically dedicated to Gina Rowlands, Betty Davis, Romy Schneider. And it should be noted that, Uma Rojo and the title itself, there is a scene where in the very, very beginning, before the title credits start, where Manuela and her son are watching All About Eve. And they're talking about Betty Davis, and Uma talks about how she named herself and she modeled herself after Betty Davis. And, she saw her smoking, so she started smoking. And that's why she gave herself the name Uma, which means, smoke, but in a feminized version. And they talk about, and the first half, well, not the first half, the first 4 scenes in Madrid at the beginning of the film, the scenes where Manuela's son gets killed, are very, very directly not lifted because that implies plagiarism, but they're inspired by Opening Night by John Cassavetes. Umarejo's character is very inspired by Gina Rowland's character in Opening Night. It's like an extension of that character. So those are very explicit thank yous, because those are the women that he was watching and that inspired him in this film, and that are referenced and talked about in this film by the characters themselves. And again, it's about the performance of womanhood. That's the way that I read the dedication this time round. It's like, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to, how much of a performance is it? How authentic is it going to be? Which carries, a whole lot of questions around gender and performative femininity, and then, the large scale questions about, what does cinema contribute to that performance, and how do we add actual acting on top of all of that? So it's so extremely layered, but then it's so emotional, because that dedication is not just to all women, it's to women who act, it's to women who act as mothers, who are not necessarily, biological mothers, and it's as well to his mother too. It's so from the heart, but also robust intellectually. I mean, come on.
Yes. It is. It's, yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I could talk to you for a really, really, really long time about this, but I feel like we probably need to bring this to a close. So I just got one more question, which is, if someone is about to watch the film for the first time, and if it's their first Almodóvar film, is there anything in particular that you would advise them that we've not covered to look out for? And then my second question is, where would you recommend they go next in his films for a newbie?
Oh, excellent. So I think what to look out for is actually the music. I think the music, the way that he uses popular music, and is so emotionally charged. The lyrics, the choice of songs, they mean something. They're communicating as much as the choice of framing, as much as the performances. So I'd always look out for that. Honestly, I think this was the first time that I watched the film that the choices of music really brought me to tears. In terms of, to answer the second part of your question, what to go to watch next, the easy answer would be Volver, because it tackles a lot of similar themes, and it also has Penélope in a wonderful leading role. But I would actually say go backwards and watch What Have I Done to Deserve This with Carmen Maura. And it's also incredibly cinephile, but it's a big melodrama. It's a very dark melodrama. It's like a suburban melodrama set in the 80s in Madrid, in essentially like an estate in Madrid. And Carmen Manuela, I think, is one of his leading ladies who he's done some absolutely stunning work with, especially in the earlier part of their careers. She's been with him throughout his work in the 80s. And this is very, very inspired by melodramas of George Cukor as well, but through the lens of post-Franco Spain. And also through the lens of someone, you can see in that film that he's starting to move from the punk, transgressive, absolutely put everything out there, make it fun and explicit and absolutely hilarious and antagonistic almost to everything that had been forced on Spanish society beforehand. You still get a lot of that. It's very fun. It's very out there, even by today's standards. But it's so laden with emotion, and it is about a mother trying to be good to her son, to her children, and trying to do as much as she possibly can within very strict means. And there's some wonderful shots. There's some kind of things that feel almost precursors to certain shots in All About My Mother. But again, it kind of sits in that in between of very, very punk Almodóvar and very grounded, emotionally profound Almodóvar cinema. So I'd recommend go backwards to What Have I Done to Deserve This from 1984.
Amazing, amazing. Anna Bogutskaya, thank you so much for choosing All About My Mother and for chatting to us for a film you love. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me.